So you're on page 39. We're looking at motion 35, towards the Left Unity anti-racism policy. And I ask the anti-racism policy group to come and speak. We're going back to that.
Comrades, Richard Seymour, Barnet, Left Unity, and this is going to be pretty straightforward. Recently, Nigel Farage, I don't know if you saw, said that he was asked about the benefits that immigration brings to Britain. And he said, you know what, some things are more important than money. What he meant by that was that even if they bring benefits, I would rather have a little bit less money than live next to a bunch of foreigners. Such was his exalted position. I bring this to your attention because the people who should be our natural allies in this sort of issue, this sort of campaign, people on the Labour front bench came out and said, this is wonderful, who do you know who's recently so defied the tyranny of the market? Now, you have to think about what this means. Why is it that such exclusionary identity politics, racist politics, strikes Labour front benchers as being the only way to express any opposition to the market? And why is Farage, you know, this frog-like petty bourgeois, gaining so much support as a result of this? Farage didn't invent any of this stuff himself. We know this. It's taken 10 years or so for this stuff to build up. It's taken Gordon Brown with his British jobs for British workers shtick. It's taken the war on terror with its civilizational discourse and the shift towards talking about race in terms of culture and creed rather than biology and breed. And because it's not about biology and breed, we're led to believe now that this isn't racism. It's not really racism as such. The lie to this was given when David Starkey intervened in the context of the riots. I don't know if you remember this.
Yes.
He said, the whites have become black. What he meant by this was that white people have internalized the cultural norms and values associated with African Caribbeans in Britain. So this idea that by shifting the terrain onto culture that you're no longer talking about race is totally bogus and we should reject it. And therefore, we need to, because this politics of obscuring the real nature of racism is shared by all the major parties in Parliament and by UKIP and by the entire right wing in this country, and because there's never been to date a principled voice, we need to be that principled voice. And we need a number of things. First of all, we need, as we said in this motion, we need a comprehensive struggle against racism. What we mean by that is, it's not good enough anymore that every struggle against racism gets channeled into an anti-fascist struggle. The fascists aren't the only racists. We've seen this with UKIP. We've seen this with the Conservative Party. We've seen this with the Labour front bench. Second of all, we need to stress the need for grassroots action. That's one of the first things we talk about, the need for agency, the agency of supporting black-led organisations, for example. We cannot rely on the idea that we're going to go in and white knight people and lead them out of their racist oppression. Thirdly, we need to link it to anti-cuts activism. This should be obvious. Cuts hurt black people more, they hurt asylum seekers more, they hurt those who need benefits more. It's not just that. The use of racism, as we've seen, is a way of not talking about class politics. It's a way of diverting us from class politics. And therefore, to be able to effectively talk about the cuts, to be able to effectively talk about austerity, we have to effectively counteract racism in all its forms. We also stress the need for support for union campaigns. This is obvious. The Three Coasters campaign, this should have been supported by the official trade union. They shouldn't have had to set up a pop-up union campaign. But if that's going to happen, if immigrant workers have to fight in that way, we should be supporting them. And we should be all arguing within the unions to support those campaigns as well.
1 minute.
All right. Finally, we say something about opposing racism on the left. I'm sure I don't need to argue for that here. So essentially, this is about the fact that when we're in the hustings, when we're in trade unions, when we're out fighting political arguments in the streets and so on, when members of the left or liberals or Tories or whomever comes out with that ridiculous concession to Islamophobia, the concession to anti-immigrants politics, we need to be the ones who are standing unified against that. So that's what this motion is about. I urge you to support it. Thank you.
More passion, fantastic. Is there anybody who would like to speak against? Okay, how do you speak?
Really, Mike? Kidding?
You had me a while back, but I'm going to say this is going to be deeply unpopular. I want to argue for a reference back of this document. You know? And the case for a reference back of this document is not that any of the concrete policies at the end of the document are wrong. You know? The case for reference back of this document is that the document is framed in two ways in a wrong way. The first is it's framed within a discourse of sectionalism, you know, which then is sometimes given the name intersectionalism, and that discourse of sectionalism is inconsistent with offering a global alternative to capitalist rule. Secondly, there is an extraordinary level of artificiality in treating as the same phenomenon as empire racism against African, West Indian and South Asian communities through from the 19th century into the 1970s, the phenomenon of nativism directed against European, particularly East European migrants at the present day. And part of what's going on also, which is completely missing in this document, is the process by which the British state has adopted a policy of constructing alliances with groups of, quote, elders, unquote, with certain favoured imams, with certain favoured Christian leaders, etc., in different communities, and setting communities against each other, ethnic minority, etc., communities against each other as competitors to suck on the teats of the state. And that means that this document, although it's got some really good stuff in it, ought to be referred back.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the...
One minute, just one minute, please.
I should be
referring
uncharacteristically...
back or not?
Okay, I should be uncharacteristically concise. Right, first of all, on intersectionalism, what does this mean? It means that forms of oppression, whether racism or sexism or homophobia or so on, they shape one another, they interact, they intersect. Intersectionalism, what's the problem? Second, as regards to this being opposed to a global alternative to capitalism, no, the motion stresses that we're very much in favour of a global alternative to capitalism. In terms of it being artificial to conflate empire racism with racism against Poles and Eastern Europeans and so on, I would merely point out that, you know, no such conflation is attempted. Obviously, different phases of racism have different features, but essentially it is involved in the same type of thing, otherwise we couldn't call it racism. And finally, on the issue of favoured imams and so on, this has got nothing to do with it. This is a common strategy for dealing with racial rebellion, if you like, for co-opting and neutralising anti-racism. It's got nothing to do with the fact that we oppose Islamophobia. So I stand by the motion. Please support it.
Okay. I'm advised that we're looking at voting in favour or remitting. So, can I have a vote, a show of hands of those in favour? In favour of the motion?
No, in favour of the motion.
In favour of the motion.
No, the opposite is instead of against, it's remitting. Okay.
Thank you. Those in favour of remitting. That means putting it back for another discussion later on. That one's lost. Okay. So the motion's passed. Thank you.